Shalom from Israel. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. I will begin with a short video that describes the work of Hetz and followed by an introduction of our speakers and the speakers panel. You will have the last 20 minutes to ask questions. Please feel free to start, writing your own questions during this session or even from now. On the lower bar, you have a Q&A mark. Thank you all for joining us. Toda Rabba and Shalom.
There is an art to creating harmony, to choreographing individuals' forces into a united new power, to appreciating each color's unique qualities and their contributions to a bigger picture. While anti-Semitic groups constantly create alliances against Israel and the Jewish people,
anti-Semitism is on the rise.
They are countered by hundreds of individuals and organizations, fighting them separately. That is why we created Hetz, an arrow for Israel, so we can respond faster, hit harder, and work smarter than we ever have before. We operate models for sharing knowledge, connections, and infrastructures, thus creating trust and value among our partners, which results in hundreds of collaborations every year.
Hetz is a Hebrew word which means arrow, and what Hetz does is to bring together a number of organizations to face in the same direction, to try to achieve a target and to hit that target.
With Hetz, we are trying to connect the policymakers with the field, with the grassroots organization. Because if we want to build the huge network in Europe, we have to connect the leaders with the activists.
We deal with the issue of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the preliminary investigations into crimes supposedly conducted by Israel against the Palestinians. And we collaborated with My Truth. They bring the voices of the soldiers from the ground. We found that collaboration to be really, really powerful.
One of the projects we are starting together in the Hetz network is creating greater awareness about Jewish refugees from Arab countries. We are now coming together with some of the most dynamic pro-Israel organizations, and it's a pleasure to do projects together with them.
Hetz's approach, under the motto "Better Together," has set a unique and innovative model for a strategic and proactive thinking in the fight to defend Israel.
Hetz, better together.
Okay, so now we can get started finally. I would like to ask the speakers, first of all, to turn on their videos and to remove themselves from a muted situation. I would like to actually start with Colonel Richard Kemp and to ask you, Richard, first of all, to put your video on so we can see you, and perhaps I can help you with this. So now, all right. So Richard, my first question is for you to please describe, because you're a UK resident, the whole UK political approach to Israel since the Balfour Declaration, San Remo. There's a long history, and you've been a prominent speaker in international institutions. Please give us a little bit of your angle of the UK approach in a political sense. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Britain's relationship with Israel and the Jewish homeland has been quite varied. I think that, Britain has probably played one of the greatest roles in the recreation of the State of Israel, going back to the Balfour Declaration, and then at the same time destroying the Ottoman Empire in Palestine. And without that campaign led by General Allenby, which kicked the Turks out of that land, it's unlikely we'd have a State of Israel today. Why would Turkey not still be there? So I think those two things, above all, were very, very major contributions. And of course, many people do forget that the Balfour Declaration wasn't just a British initiative. It was also an international, had international support, including from the United States. After that period, after the time of the Balfour Declaration and then the campaign against the Ottoman Empire in 1917 and 18, and indeed our participation in the Paris Peace Conference, including San Remo, After that, things very much changed, and Britain's attitude and approach towards Israel turned very much to the negative. And you know, that was, in my understanding, that was mainly due to unbearable pressure being brought on Great Britain by the Arabs in the Middle East, who were not prepared to have Israeli, or were not prepared to have Jewish settlement at any level, really, in the land of Palestine. And Britain succumbed to that, in part, I think, because of the enormous pressures it was facing during the Second World War and immediately before the Second World War. And you know, our behaviour, Britain's behaviour towards the Jewish homeland and later towards Israel was actually despicable over that time. And I'm sure that many hundreds, if not thousands, even tens of thousands or more Jews who could have escaped from the Holocaust to get into the land of Palestine didn't do so because Britain succumbed to Arab pressure and closed down immigration. We went through also a very tricky period around the time of Israeli independence, including you know, even a British general, an active British general, leading the Jordanian forces in its attack on Israel. But then later, and I think right up until today, the relationships changed. Britain and Israel, certainly in terms of defense and security, as well as trade and intelligence, have extremely close relationships. It's disappointing to see some of the political expedients that are taken by, shall we say, some of our weaker politicians to appease those people who hate and despise Israel, and sometimes to appease the European Union. But I think, you know, on the whole, we have a very close, strong relationship, which I think will only be improved as far as Britain and Israel are concerned by our leaving the European Union.
That's very fascinating. Thank you, Richard, for this overview. And now I would like to say that, you know, other than Richard and then you, all the rest of the panel is coming from a legal perspective, and we're discussing today, you know, whose land and Israel now and then in perspective, you know, to the San Remo conference and the Follow Declaration and Balfour Declaration. And I want to just go back to the legal discussion. Now that we understood that some of the approach by Britain has come from international pressures, and I would like to address the next question to Yifa. You know, Yifa, a lot of people are confused when they hear the term international law. Okay, some people think there is you know, a particular angle for an international law, but in practice there are other implications of, you know, making actions that has to do with Israel and the Israeli territories, whether they are disputed or not. So can you a little bit elaborate on the distinction between what people perceive as international law and what it really means? Thank you.
Okay, well, hello, first of all, and I'm happy to be here. So I'll tell you what, I think that the use of international law has been turned into some kind of a battling tool against, you know, against Israel particularly, but also you see it being sounded a lot by many people that have no idea, you know, what international law actually means. And I think it made it easy for a lot of people to start using it because, you know, you can count on one hand how many people can actually, you know, argue, you know, successfully argue against it. And so it became like, I'll give you an example. If, you know, people say an illegal occupation, okay? So illegal occupation, for example, is not even a thing in international law. It doesn't exist. You know, if it did exist, then we could have argued if, you know, the territories are illegally occupied or not illegally occupied. But the very fact that there is an illegal occupation by principle just doesn't exist in international law. And still, you see everyone, you know, millions of people are using that to attack Israel by saying Israel is illegally occupying the territories. Now, who will now explain to all these people that there is no such thing? I mean, if you want to argue against the Israeli possession of the territories or the fact that there is or is not a Palestinian state on a certain geographical space, fine, argue that, but, you know, to just make up things as a battling tool has become such a practice that we now have to, you know, start from the very beginning and try to first explain to people what does and does not even exist in the sense of international law. And I want to tell you personally that it took me at least 10 years of practicing international law, practicing law along these lines to even feel comfortable enough to call myself an expert. In the beginning, people said, "Oh, she's an expert in Israel." I went, "Whoa, wait." But this is used by so many people that have no background, not in law and not in international law, or not even enough knowledge of this specific these specific issues, that you can find a lot of examples like that. And just to finish off your question, I would say that there have been a lot of cases that we wanted to bring to various courts around the world. And when people ask me, what do you think your chances are? Then I would say, if this was just about the law, then this is an easy case, an open shut case that should be very easy to win. But because this involves Israel or Israelis, then you just never know how this will turn out. And I think it brings us to what goes on now with the ICC, because I think legally, if you just you take out the emotional part, the component of what a lot of people would like to see the result of the ICC, and just look at the law, I think it's a very easy case. But yet we all know that nothing is easy about the current situation with the ICC, unfortunately.
Okay, well, sounds fair enough. Thank you so much. And jumping back to a non-lawyer, I will have to ask you a little bit about the background of you. I mean, you're not Jewish, and you're not a lawyer. Right. Well, if you are a Jewish, the chances that you'll become a lawyer are increasing. But I wonder, I mean, what made you go and make and produce a film and write a film about Israel? Why Israel? And just with a little bit about your background, I mean, what led you to do so?
Well, most of the films I've made about Israel to date have been for Christian audiences, not this one with Whose Land. One of the big problems that Israel faces, and Yifa alluded to this, is that it actually boils down to people simply hate the Jewish state. The history, modern history of Israel and the ancient history of Israel is being rewritten, has been rewritten by Israel's detractors and enemies. And I felt the need to actually tell the story of Israel's factual, verifiable history. I've actually had this project in mind for nearly 30 years. Then about 10 years ago, at the time of the 90th anniversary of the San Remo resolution, the whole legal question came to my mind. And as you said, I'm not a lawyer, but I realized actually that Israel's rights in international law were being distorted. And I really felt the need to tell this story too. And I'm very, very grateful for Colonel Richard Kemp for becoming part of this whole matter of being able to help me tell this story, along with Avi Bell and Andrew Tucker, to express the legal side. And there are many other lawyers that we've interviewed in Whose Land. So far, we've only managed to produce the first part of it. And this takes us up to 1948, because it's very important to establish Israel's legal foundations. And Israel's legal foundations, certainly at San Remo and before that, the Balfour Declaration, are based on the Jewish historical presence in Jerusalem and in the land of Israel, which of course is the very thing that the Palestinians today are trying to deny. And why are they trying to deny it? Because they're trying to delegitimize Israel's legal rights. If you deny Israel's history in the land of Israel, you're in a position where you can deny Israel's legal rights, because Israel's legal rights are partly based on history. And so this is why we're making the film Whose Land, because really it's like Joseph Goebbels. He once said words to the effect that if you repeat a lie often enough, the people will believe it. And that is what's happening not only in the Arab Muslim media, but it's happening in the Western media as well. For instance, our BBC only ever tell part of the story, and that's why we're making Whose Land.
Thank you for that, Now, I remember that you've mentioned that you're working on the second part of Whose Land, which will involve the San Remo Declaration. And I actually wanted to ask Avi Bell a question regarding this. As Avi, we just marked the 100th anniversary of San Remo Declaration, of the Allied powers regarding Palestine, or the situation in Palestine. I wanted to know, does this history make any difference today, and does it affect any of the current disputes and chances for peace?
So I think that San Remo is part of a larger story. San Remo, for those who don't know, was where the Allied powers gathered after World War I to decide what European powers would take control of the colonial possessions of the losers of the war, the Turkish Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire. And among the things that they decided there were that Britain would take control of the Holy Land, what they called Palestine and we call Israel, and that it would be responsible in that land, in Israel, for reconstituting the ancient Jewish homeland. That decision at San Remo was then thereafter ratified by the League of Nations in 1922. It served as the basis of the British administration up until 1948. It served as the basis thereafter for the Jewish community of that land, declaring itself in 1948 to be an independent state. And because of that mandate, when Israel became a state, under the legal doctrine known as uti potestatis juris, it's a Latin name that sounds intimidating, but basically means new countries get the borders of the old administrative units. Because of that mandate, the borders of Israel since 1948 have been the borders of the British Mandate. And it's a very clean historical line from World War I to the present that makes very clearly the case that Israel has the lawful right to all of the territories that we call Palestine or Israel or the Holy Land, whichever term you prefer. Now, it's important to say that that's just the legal part of it. Now, I have to add, there's another moral, historical part to this. And it's a shame that we don't talk about that enough. When the Allied powers met in San Remo and decided on giving the land of Palestine to the Jews, it wasn't as an act of colonialism. It was in fact splitting away the imperial possessions of the Turkish Empire to give them to the peoples to whom these lands belonged. And the Allied powers recognized very clearly, as the British government had said in 1917, that the Jews have a right to their own ancient homeland. It's by right, it's not by grace. Or if it's the grace of God, not the grace of the League of Nations. That right has not disappeared. Now, if you look, for example, at let's say just a few days ago, the prosecutor to the International Criminal Court tried to make an argument as to why Israel cannot claim any rights to Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, as she calls it. And her claim was that sovereignty to that land lies in the Palestinian people. Now, this is not really an international law doctrine. This is a political doctrine. In international law, sovereignty belongs to states, not to peoples. But if it belongs to a people, way back in San Remo, the Allied countries decided that that sovereignty belongs to the Jewish people. And if you want to go back further, way back 3,500 years ago, a superior authority decided that sovereignty belongs to the Jewish people. And so if we want to bring in history to trump the law, then we have to remember that there is a history here, and it is a very favorable history to the claims of the Jewish people.
So, okay, so we spoke about, the history about it, but jumping actually forward and to more recent actions by the European Court of Justice. And the next question is for you, Andrew. What do you think about the recent decisions of the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, that products from the so-called occupied territories must be labeled as such? What is the legitimacy behind this, and what is your point of view as an international law expert, if I may say?
Thank you, Aaron. Yes, thank you. Hello, everybody. Good to be here. I think most of you are probably aware, towards the end of last year, the European Court of Justice came down with a decision in a case related to the import of wine from the Psagot winery just north of Jerusalem. It's a winery which is located in what is called the occupied territories. It's outside the Green Line. And a case had been brought in France to claim that under European health regulations, food and safety law, products need to indicate their land of provenance, the place that they were produced. So the question is, well, where are these products produced? And the court, European Court of Justice in Strasbourg came down with a decision which basically was an expression of European policy. It wasn't really a very legal analysis at all. And the European position has been very clear since 1973 that what is called East Jerusalem, and of course we have to realize that that is the old city of Jerusalem and its surroundings, containing the most holy sites for all three Abrahamic faiths, and especially for the Jewish people. And most importantly, of course, the Temple Mount and the Western Wall. These areas are, according to European policy, not to be regarded as part of Israel. That's been a policy which was implemented, as I said, in the early 1970s, after the Yom Kippur War, as part of a political deal that Europe did with the Arab nations to create an open relationship with the Arab world, invite the Arab world into Europe, and gain access to, obviously, oil and gas in the Middle East. And the price that was paid was Palestine. Europe agreed to support the Palestinian project. Now, so you'll see when the European Court of Justice picked up on this, it's almost obliged to apply European law on this, which, as I say, is a political law, not a law based on analysis of international law. The fact is, Europe does not want Jerusalem to be part of Israel, and therefore it says it can't be. So I think when you look at the European Court of Justice, the legal reasoning is extremely weak, if not to say almost non-existent. And to pick up on the points that Yifa was made and Avi, there's not even a single mention of San Remo or the mandate. In many ways reflecting the International Court of Justice in 2004, which skipped over this part of history. And for Europeans, the world started in 1967. That's what happened, and Europe and Israel occupied territory, and that's their analysis.
Well, the good old
Iran, if I may, it's not
Yes.
only to the Europeans, The ICC prosecutor is required to report every year on the status of her preliminary investigations. For the first several years, she reported on her investigation into Palestinian complaints. She said explicitly that the history of the conflict begins in 1967. It was a shocking display of lack of understanding of any of the history, and it matches exactly this European attitude. It's not only Europe that is deliberately misrepresenting history here.
Yeah, good point, Avi.
It's part of the good old political game, and Avi, I think that you've mentioned this previously around the role of UNESCO, taking a particular position about holy sites and historical artifacts in the Holy Land as part of the Palestinian campaign of creating a narrative, a new history. And currently, the political game, and Richard, I'm actually curious to hear your thoughts on this, because currently we have a very controversial president in the US, the President Trump. But putting aside the controversy, he presented a peace plan that includes many interesting parts. What is the likelihood to get a backwind for applying such a plan? And what is the other perspectives that you see around the peace for prosperity?
I think it's. I mean, I recognise the objections and the problems surrounding this plan and pretty much any plan that's ever been put forward. But I think it's the best plan I've ever seen for attempting to resolve the situation in the Middle East. And as I think we all know, Israel proposes to reassert its sovereignty over certain areas of Judea and Samaria, which have been, which were as far as most people who follow these situations are concerned, would agree that these areas would have become part of Israel under, let's say, a two-state solution with pretty much any borders agreed. And clearly including the Jordan Valley, which is, in fact, the whole of Judea and Samaria, but the Jordan Valley in particular is crucial for Israel's security. I think as far as the Arab countries are concerned in the Middle East, that we've seen a degree of support for this plan, including, I think, from Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Jordan, I'm sure, would support the idea of Israel permanently being present on the Jordan Valley, because of course that takes care of major security worries that would occur to Jordan should the idea, for example, leave that area. But of course Jordan will never say that, or is very unlikely to say that. It has to object and protest to these proposals. As far as the West is concerned, I think we will see, certainly Europe, shall we say, we will see predictably, we will see objections to this happening, pretty strong objections. And we've already seen, for example, in the UK, a couple of days ago, a group of MPs, a large number of members of parliament here, wrote a letter to the government telling them it should Israel reassert its sovereignty in the West Bank, absent Palestinian agreement, then Israel should be sanctioned by the British government. And I think that's the way we're going to see things run. But the reality is, I think, that we've got almost a situation, which I think was the intention of this peace proposal. We've got almost a situation where many Arab countries roughly speaking, support a plan, although they change their mind now and again, but roughly speaking, support a plan. Israel supports a plan. The United States supports a plan. And who doesn't support the plan? The Palestinians. And I think it shows, the idea of the drafters of this agreement, I think, was to show that actually the problem here, the problem over peace, is the Palestinians. Up to now, they've always had a veto over any forward progress with a peace process. And now, if this goes ahead, they're not going to have a veto, because Israel will re-exert sovereignty. It will have the support of the United States. No doubt plenty of people object to it. But I think it'll be a major step forward in achieving, possibly in the future, some resolution, with allowing the Palestinians the veto on a peace process, a veto on any progress in the peace process. We've seen for decades what the results of that are. and they would continue to be that if we didn't have a change of this sort, because the Palestinian leadership, certainly, in my opinion, will never, ever agree to a two-state solution that has a Jewish state as part of it. They only want the annihilation of the Jewish state. I'm not talking about every Palestinian here, I'm talking about Palestinian leaders, but of course they have a great deal of support among their populations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you know, a lot of the conversation right now in Israel, it's actually the news we hear and read it, that applying sovereignty or expanding the Israeli law into the Jordan Valley, which is part of the so-called West Bank, is going to take place soon enough, possibly in July. And I wanted to ask you if whether such an act would be considered as a violation of international law, or either a violation of the Oslo Accords, as Rory thoroughly asked me by email and wanted to share this question. Would it be any violation in acting so?
Wow, that's a big question.
So answer shortly, because we don't have a lot of time.
How long do we have? Look, I think that the premise is very, very important. I mean, in my view, and a lot of, I think, the panelists and others, when you do a fair and honest analysis of international law, and you look at history, and you know, not like the ICC has done. I mean, if you read her review, or she refers back to the United Nations report on history of the region, it's just, you know, it's unbelievable, you know, the types of distortions of facts and history that they've done in that report. But if you do an honest analysis, then I do believe that the claim that Israel has the best title, and what we're doing now is, or the plan to do is to apply Israeli law to a place where the state of Israel is entitled to sovereignty. And I think, you know, Avi and Andrew and I had a very passionate discussion with a few others that, you know, the use of the word annexation here is absolutely wrong, and it creates the wrong impression that people just fundamentally don't understand the difference between annexation of territory and applying Israeli law to territories where we believe that we are already sovereign. So if this is your premise, and this is definitely mine and a lot of my colleagues, then this is in no shape or form a violation of international law in any way whatsoever. This is applying our law to a territory where we are already sovereign. The question of the Oslo Accords is a different question. I think maybe even possibly a bit more complicated one. Again, not if you look at the analysis that the prosecutor has done to the Oslo Accords, which he changed it dramatically and fundamentally. But if you really look at the Oslo Accords, there is one thing there in the Oslo Accords that we need to overcome, and that is an agreement between Israel and the PLO, the Palestinian leadership, that no unilateral steps will be taken to basically change the rights on the ground, territories. And what Israel will potentially be doing is unilaterally change the status of the territories by applying Israeli law to these territories. However, I think that the counter argument to that is that the Palestinians have long violated the exact same article in the Oslo Accords. I'm not even talking about other things like terrorism and incitement and pay for slay and everything else, but I'm talking specifically about this clause in the Oslo Accords, because when the Palestinians went to the United Nations to seek recognition of statehood, to the United Nations, to various countries around the world, that is exactly what they did. They unilaterally made steps to change the legal status in violation of the Oslo Accord. So, and this is what we're facing. We keep on referring to the ICC. So this is exactly what we're facing now in the ICC, because according to the Oslo Accords, the Palestinians should have never applied to be accepted as a state party to the Rome Treaty. And this in and of itself, the situation that we are facing now in the ICC, is a breach of that same clause of the Oslo Accords. So I think this is how we should address that. A, no, it's not a violation of international law. B, yes, it's problematic when it comes to Oslo, but this is the counter argument as far as I can see.
Great, thank you. So, I have a lot of questions more to ask you, but we're already in the money time, and I really wanted to introduce some questions from the audience. We have a lot of questions here. Hopefully, we can cover all of them or most of them. If not, we will send you some answers by email. So, those of you who did not submit questions, the questions are to be submitted in the Q&A part on the lower bar. First question from Emily Bruel. How can we make the British government and all the world aware of the importance of San Remo? And I would like to address this question to you, Richard, please.
Yeah, it's very easy thing to do, I think, to persuade the British government of it. The fact is, the British government is well aware of the real situation, and I think, Boris Johnson, for example, is one of a long line of certainly our strongest prime ministers who have been very, very pro-Israel. And you go back to David Lloyd George, Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, of course, and Tony Blair and various others who have been extremely pro-Israel. They understand the reality of the situation, and I'll just give you an example. I had a conversation with the British ambassador in Tel Aviv. Obviously, that's the wrong place for the British ambassador to be. He should be in Jerusalem, really. But I had a conversation with him a few years back, not the current one. And I asked, the British government says that the policy of settlements, etc., in Judea and Samaria are illegal. Why do they do that? I can't understand it. I've looked, I'm not a lawyer, but I have examined it carefully. I can't see the illegality. And he explained it to me, and I still didn't understand what he was saying. He didn't really understand himself either. And eventually I spoke to one of his most senior officials in the embassy, and he said, no, we know, the British government knows these settlements are not illegal. They simply use that terminology in order to apply pressure to Israel. And that's the reality. That sort of really, I think, in many ways sums up the British government's approach to this. They feel that, and a lot of it's been done in accordance with EU policies, but they feel they have to always take the side of the Palestinians on many of these issues. And partly that's to do with appeasement of Arabs in the Middle East, and partly it's to do with appeasement of Muslim populations back at home in the UK, and as I say, partly to appease the EU. But so I don't think it's a matter of understanding. I think it's more a matter of a political decision. And I hope that, over time, perhaps, I mentioned when we come out of the EU, it might change. But I hope that we will take a much more robust approach. And I hope we'll see a reasonable British reaction should Israel not annex the West Bank, but should reassert its sovereignty over Judea and Samaria.
Great, thank you. Well, next question from Ilan Sarfi. I would like to address the question to you, Andrew. The question is it not all the UN resolutions that are passed against Israel, not the root cause of people thinking it is international law, even though it goes against the principles of what was agreed on at San Remo and the mandate for Palestine 1922, signed by the League of Nations and therefore adopted by the UN?
Okay. Well, it's a good question. I think international law changed fundamentally in 1945 with the creation of the UN system. So at least the law didn't change, but the system changed. And with the creation of the General Assembly, I think there's been a sort of an increasing desire that we have a kind of a world government that tells us what the law should be. So in my view, I think you have like two basic lines of approach. One of those are the lawyers who say, well, international law is based on the consent and the sovereignty of states. And it's states who make international law. And international law is not universal. It doesn't solve every problem in the world. States make the law. The other approach is to say, no, we have an international system. It's a global system. And whatever comes out of New York, we should treat as being at least persuasive, if not determinative of law. And I think it's that second category of people who have a political desire that there should be some kind of uniform system, and we look to the General Assembly because it is the only plenary forum where states can take action. But the reality is, all of these resolutions that come out, if you analyze them, they're all passed by about 120 states, maybe 130, of a total of 190 to 195 states. So it's a kind of bare majority. And what is happening is you have this majority of coalitions of blocks of states forming political blocks, and it's primarily the Islamic states together with it's been the South Americans, it's been the former Russian influenced states. And then you have a whole bunch of states who don't take a position. There's always 20 or 30 states who don't vote. And then you have a tiny group of states who vote in favor of Israel and the Jewish people. So it's by no means universal. And this idea that there is an international consensus on these things is absolutely rubbish, because there is no consensus. You know, you only need 10 significant states to put up their finger and say, we disagree. And by definition, you don't have consensus anymore. And this view is being ignored because people like to think that there is a universal approach to this.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Andrew. I have a question from Joseph Flashner. Perhaps, Avi, perhaps you can address this from a perspective of property rights. The question is: are there property deeds that could be made into an exhibit showing an active real estate market going back 100 years ago? That's an interesting question.
If I understand the question, I think it's trying to relate to the question of sovereignty, and it's actually it's a common misperception that sovereignty and property are the same thing. If we know who the owner is in property rights, we know who the owner is in terms of sovereign rights. I'm appearing to you from Jerusalem. I'm sitting in my home. If you look at the deeds, that's what they say, that I own it. But the land is not mine in a sovereign sense. The sovereign here is the state of Israel, not me. Proving who has title in the sense of property is really not going to resolve very much. And I'll have to add, if you go back about 100 years, you will see that the title in the land belonged overwhelmingly to the Turks, to the Sultan of Turkey. It did not belong to any private individuals. Under the rules at the time, it was more or less impossible for Jews to buy land. Does that determine the ability today of a Jewish state to have sovereign title? I think not. Now, if I could just very briefly say something about add something to something that Andrew said. I think it's a very, very important point. It's not simply that there is no consensus, and Andrew's absolutely right, there is no consensus, but there's something very important to understand about international law. International law is not a reality show. It doesn't become the law that because the participants have voted you off the island, that now that's the state of international law. And international law doesn't work that way. It's a set of common rules that are applied to states. And if you see that those rules are applied only to one state, the Jewish state, and they don't apply to anyone else, then we're really not talking about law. We're talking about reality show rules where everybody can gang up and toss someone off the island. And with all due respect, we're not interested in being voted off the island again. We've had enough experience with that, and this time we're not moving.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, next question from David Schlanger. I would like to refer it to Richard. No discriminations here, okay? That's instant. Who are our allies on the Arab side, specific leaders, and how do we get the Arab on the street, the individual Arab, to have an awareness of the Israeli position?
I was in Saudi Arabia a short while ago, and I was talking to some of the leaders in Saudi Arabia who told me that they would like nothing better at this particular time. And we all know why it is a problem for Saudi Arabia now, because they're so terrified of Iran. They would like nothing better than to openly be, allied and supporting of Israel. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that any Arab country will adopt that as its, absolute long-term permanent policy, because these things are all tactical. But I believed him when he said that, or the ones who were talking to me when they said that this was the case. And I said, so get on with it. And the response, of course, was our people would not accept it. It would not be tolerated. And of course, the reason for that is that they've been fed decades and decades of hatred for the Jews by their governments, not just Saudi Arabia, but most, if not all, Arab governments in the Middle East. And even those countries like Egypt and Jordan, which have peace treaties with Israel, there's still an overwhelming majority of the people hate and despise the Jews and hate Israel. And the only way, I think, to bring that around, if it can be done at all, is by these governments engaging in, or at least stopping their anti-Israel propaganda. And the same applies, probably even more importantly, to the Palestinian Authority. We see on a daily basis, we see the hatred that's spewed out against Israel by the Palestinian Authority in their official media and in many other means. And even for example, while Israel's been doing a huge amount to help Palestinians, Israeli Arabs, even Palestinian Arabs in Gaza, to help them fight against coronavirus, we've also seen some of their leaders accusing Israel of doing the opposite. So while that goes on, not just among the Palestinians, but among Arabs generally, then the likelihood of Arabs being ever becoming not just pro-Israel, but not being absolutely hostile towards Israel is very, very low. But I think that the current situation with Iran is a strong motivator for Arab governments to work more closely with Israel, and there are many, many examples of that happening. And the other major factor, of course, is the United States of America. In some ways, actually, President Obama did Israel a favor by effectively siding with Iran, because that terrified the hell out of many other Arab countries who got closer to Israel as a consequence. But I think that the pressure by the United States of America on Arab countries, plus their fear of a common enemy in Iran, I think is the only way that things are going to move forward. And of course, if they do move forward, and of course the danger when I don't know what's going to happen in November, but let's assume President Trump gets a second term, but then after his second term is finished, then I think it's highly likely, if we see a Democrat government in the US, we will see a very, very big backlash against everything that the Trump administration has been doing that works in Israel's favor.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Well, we have a little time left. I would like to address the next question to Yifa, and then a few more comments, and we'll wrap it up. So Andrea Spindle is asking for us to address the consequences. I will just say it in a different way. So what happens if tomorrow Israel, applies sovereignty all over the West Bank and
that is law, Israeli law, Iran.
Israeli law, yeah.
Not sovereignty.
Israeli law, which will make it possibly a sovereign, because we have Israeli law in other parts of Israel. It doesn't mean that we act as a sovereign entity. So what is worst case scenario of a backlash from such an act? And please, just 2 minutes.
Well, the possible backlashes are many. I actually don't like to be the pessimistic voice. I would like to be the optimistic voice in these things. I mean, we can all we can always imagine the worst tragedies, and everyone hates us and they're all sanction us and everything is being speed up in the ICC and in the. Okay, fine, but I think at the end of the day, and if you look at everything that Richard had said, and Andrew and Avi and everyone, that I think that we're moving in a very positive direction. I mean, we still can't see it. And I think that's what's the most, that's the trickiest element of the present, is that there are a lot of things that are happening, you know, under the surface, like the relationship with the Arab countries, as Richard pointed out. I think there's a relationship, there's a new potential in Europe. I mean, the big threat that the Arab nations have had on Europe when it came to the supply of oil over the previous decades is now potentially changing, because the powers that provide oil to Europe, as well as the potential gas pipe that we are planning to build together with Egypt and Cyprus and Greece into Europe. I mean, there are so many different elements that may potentially affect the relationship or the leveraging power that, you know, the Arab countries have had in the past, when the most important thing they had was to get, you know, to achieve the annihilation of the Jewish state. All of a sudden, their interests are changing. The Europeans' interests maybe are starting to change. We don't know what will happen with the future of the European Union now after this current crisis. So I think we can be very optimistic. And I'll say another word. I think that in the last...
Unfortunately, we don't have enough time for another word, but I understand it's not a game of love, but rather a game of interests, and the interests are changing in time, hopefully for the benefit of Israel, but who knows. Last comment, please, from you. If you just may say a little bit, you know, a few words about the next stage of your film. And just before that, I would just like to say to everyone that we're going to send you some materials by email about the things that have been said here, if you want to dig a little bit deeper into the arguments. And today is apparently also Giving Tuesday, and some of the people here are working in not-for-profit organizations, so we'll be happy for your support. You'll receive an information by email. Last comment from you, just to address the next stage in your film, please.
Yes, well, part one, which was released a while ago, takes us up to 1948 and focuses very much on the legal foundation. Part two deals with from 1948 to today, and as Richard mentioned very early on, the Arab invasion of Israel in 1948 was in itself illegal. And then, of course, we look at the legality of Israel's self-defensive war in 1967. And then we go on to the present situation today. And the big question is, really, are the Palestinian leadership really interested in peaceful coexistence with the Jewish state? And they won't even recognize the right of the Jewish state to exist. And we need to look at that and actually expose it too. And so that's what we're doing with part two and maybe even part three of Whose Land.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. We had hundreds of people here, and a lot of people stayed all the way through. So I thank everyone who were able to join us. And I also want to thank all the speakers for giving the time and to address such important topics. I wish you all good luck. Stay healthy and strong. And I'll see you in good occasions. Take care. Toda rabba.
Toda rabba.
Bye-bye.